Ladies and gentlemen, tonight here at the Leak Project, we have guest Gordon White. Gordon is founder of RuneSoup.com, one of the most widely read practical sorcery blogs on the internet today. Considered by many to be a magician's magician, Gordon has been crowned the Dark Prince of modern chaos magic. Mr. White's newest work, Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, is a text of the new magical renaissance. Mr. White brings his globally recognized data and demographic skills to a groundbreaking piece of truly interdisciplinary research, using mythological, linguistic, and astronomical data to reconstruct Paleolithic magical beliefs. Gordon maps them to the human journey out of Africa, explores which aspects of these beliefs and practices have survived into the Western tradition, and what the implications of those survivals may be. Tonight, minds will be blown. Gordon, it's great to have you on the show tonight with us here at the Leak Project. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. It's wonderful to be here, Rex.
It's great to have you. I know it's about 6 hours later where you're at because you're in London right now. We talked for a second before the broadcast, and London, in my opinion, is definitely the epicenter of the globe. I think that everything kind of leads back to London, which some people call the new Rome. So just a great place to be. I haven't been there yet, but I do have family that has spent some time in the UK, and I know that just a lot of neat stuff's going on out there. But what I was hoping you could do for us, Gordon, is tell us about who you are and really what got you into some of these incredible realms of the occult and chaos magic, etc.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm Australian born and raised. I have English family, so up until about the age of 20, I was living in a couple of places just north of Sydney and then Sydney itself, and then moved to New Zealand and was there for about 7 years, and then moved to the UK about 8 years ago. So that's the kind of physical journey piece. When it specifically comes to magic, well, it's kind of two lines through that, I suppose. There appears to be a sort of family component to it, although I was certainly not raised in a tradition or it was ever even really discussed down the matrilineal line. But my sort of magical journey began in an odd way. Sort of woke up very early one Saturday morning at the age of 13, aware that something had happened, some sort of dream state experience, and stole $50 from my mother's wallet and walked down the hill. We had a sort of very good independent bookshop, the likes of which you just don't find anymore, about 3-4 miles away. So I walked down to that and bought a few books and sat in a grandstand of a rugby oval that was sort of about halfway home with these books and read, and it was sort of off to the races from there. So that was the beginning, I suppose, of my interest in magic. And I don't know, maybe I'll meet a hypnotist one day and find out what that dream situation was. But from the perspective of the story in Starships, which is about Paleolithic culture and where these ideas came from, and that whole giant question mark about humanity, I suppose, that came at around the same time, perhaps a little bit later. There are some sort of cornerstone texts which everyone who kind of cut their teeth in the 90s would remember, like Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods and so on. So that has always been there. I've been all over the Pacific, and I've shot an underwater documentary at Nan Madol. So there's been a lot of sort of physical components of looking at it, but the history piece has always been there, and it's always been something that I have found particularly psychologically enriching, but also probably a bit important. So yeah, that's where all that began, I guess.
When you first got into the occult, you had that real cool vision or dream, and you stole $50 from your mom and you took off to the bookstore. What books did you get?
I guess the first few books were the most widely available ones because I wasn't really sure where I was going. So there were a few sort of paperback Wiccan solitary druidry type things, which made me realize that this stuff was out there. And my first few, I guess, magical rituals were based around that, and actually got some surprisingly good effects out of them, as people do the first time they start things. But you kind of quickly know when you're playing that cosmic game of "Are you my mother?" That this isn't really the road for you, and then kind of moved through. I think it was the sort of purple hardback version of Magic in Theory and Practice, and eventually, and I guess in fairly short order because Weiser had recently reprinted them, found Peter J. Carroll's Chaos Magic books, and that was home. That was where I thought this is the stuff for me. And so ever since then, it's been voracious reading across everything. Less so with magical books these days because after 20 years of reading them, they have to be pretty good to have the sufficient amount of context to pay for it. But once you
Sure.
have that sort of deep structure, you tend to derive a lot more information or value from reading history books and psychology books and so on. The thing about magic, as I'm sure you know, is like if the universe is magical, it's all magic. So it's sort of about how you sort of see the world. But my journey was fairly typical. It started with kind of eclectic neo-paganism, and then quickly on to sort of classic chaos magic.
So it sounds like the chaos magic really resonated with you. I spoke with Andrea Vitimus a while back. He wrote a book on chaos magic. Great guy. And
Yeah, he's good people, and he's a great magician too.
yeah, and I know he's also into Haitian voodoo. He didn't want to talk much about that, and that's totally understandable. But really, the chaos magic, I would like to hear your definition of it, and what it was that resonated with you so much to kind of really move forward towards that path.
I guess it resonated with me, but it was also in the air at the time. So we're talking early to mid 90s. So progressive trance music, the very beginnings of the internet, uh, Grant Morrison comics, that kind of thing. So it was in the air. It just seemed like the right time and place. And I was in my teens, so I had a certain amount of fuck youism about the world, and it kind of really worked. And also, it just like it did work. The way of seeing the world, and in particular, some of Peter J. Carroll's characterizations of how this might all hang together and not violate the rules of physics. Although I don't subscribe completely at all, actually, to his sort of, he's kind of a theoretical physicist or a rogue theoretical physicist. But what that demonstrated was that you actually can, just like in the Renaissance, match these what we call paranormal effects to a proper functioning universe, because the effects are real, so they actually need to be found in the model in some way. And that really appealed to me, because chaos magic allows you to retain that, not balance, it's not very balanced, but it allows you to retain that way of seeing the world and incorporate other pieces in. There are inevitably, you kind of get the squeamish political or cultural challenges surrounding appropriation, and in a lot of cases they're certainly true, but you learn the hard way by doing how far into and out of sort of additional systems that you append that you can actually go. But it's just been it was the thing at the time. It was cool, and I was a teenager, so I wanted to be cool. Probably wasn't, let's be honest, and it just kind of matched how I saw the world, and I've stuck with it. I know a lot of people went through their chaos magic phase, and then it became very unfashionable, but that's never really been a thing. I've never really been described as fashionable, so that hasn't been an issue for me. So I kind of stuck with my shoulder pads and permed hair magic
Nice.
the whole way through the noughties into the 2000 teens. And funnily enough, it's coming back around again. And I get to be old enough to say, like, I was doing this the first time, like my parents did with flares when they briefly came back in 1991. So yeah, it's just been how I see the world. It's quite invitational. It's more rigorous than people think. And funnily enough, if you read Pete Carroll's more recent stuff, somewhere along the way, it's got this idea it's chaos magic is invoking Superman and doing whatever you want. And it's actually not. It's actually very difficult and very challenging, because there are no excuses for failure. So you can't fall back into a thelemic or Neoplatonic mystical reasons for why something did or didn't work. You've either succeeded or you haven't. And that sort of no bullshit iterative process is very useful. I find that very useful. I wasn't really looking for a religion, and it's definitely not that. It's and I think if people stick with it for long enough, chaos magic on the surface looks very shallow, but it gets very deep and challenging if you stick with it for a while.
Well, and if we could get into that, because there's so many different forms of magic. You've got chaos magic, hermetics. There's Asian practices, African practices, voodoo, etc. And I find it fascinating that there's a lot of connections with all of them. And like you said earlier, if the universe has magic in it, then everything is magical. I mean, just a thought of, hey, I want something to happen. You're manifesting that at some point, so you could connect that to magic and quantum physics and science, etc. But I'm just trying to figure out like what the best definition of chaos magic is, because when you say there's no room for failure there, when I talked to Andrea, he made it sound more of like chaos magic was, it could be anything. You don't need any dogmatic rituals or, any sigils or anything. It's just, it's everything. And I really wasn't able to grasp a real solid ideal or concept of what chaos magic actually is.
When it comes to something like chaos magic or anything in particular or general, and this almost speaks to the motivation behind starships, but understanding its historical context sort of clears up a lot of things. So chaos magic emerged from the sort of a group of magicians in north of England, and then some who kind of moved to London and picked up a few other people in the late 70s, early 80s, called the Stoke Newington Sorcerers, and they would just really test out ideas. The occult scene at the time was quite moribund. The OTO was a basket case of different factions and all the kind of usual stuff that orders undergo during collapse. But also just in general, the scene had kind of staggered out of the 70s with a whole bunch of astrology and Carlos Castaneda and so on. So it was really about trying out on ideas and to see if there is a deep structure behind all of them. And as for the name, it sounds all spooky now because, I mean, they did play around with the Necronomicon and so on. But Pete Carroll kind of arbitrarily picked it because at the time, as chaos mathematics was sort of in the news and James Glake's book called Chaos was out, he's like, well, let's call it that. It's that same sort of idea of a non-stochastic or unpredictable universe and how we can achieve an understanding of it from these sort of emerging fields of things like data science. So chaos magic is rigorous in the sense that it is looking for things that work rather than trying to sell you a particular view of what goes on. And it's very expansive as a result. And that's why once you got into the 90s and the X-Files was on TV, comics were big, that kind of thing. We kind of forget at the time that the images in culture, like you had the gray alien smoking the joint and all those kind of just depictions were there. So a lot of temporary silliness, which was allowed, was there. So path workings with Superman rather than Apollo and that kind of thing. And they're always experiments in that sense. They're a premise that what will happen, will this be the same as an Apollo path working? Will it be better? Will it be worse? Will it do anything? And for some reason or another, probably the rise of the internet, which happened at the same time, at least outside of kind of British circles, the view of chaos magic is ossified around that one particular moment in time. And interestingly, and I actually think another part of it is that Pete's earlier books, which a lot of the ideas in them, because they're 30 or 40 years old now, he's kind of disavowed. He's like, look, it was the mid 80s. I was much, much younger. They're kind of readily found online for free. And in this modern world, you have, for some reason, even when it's something as important as magic, that expectation of free. And so you have this idea, like the majority perception of chaos magic is actually quite out of date because that's the stuff that's available online. But if you look at his last, say, 3 books, you'll see that from a discourse perspective, he's certainly moved on and he's abandoned some ideas and picked other ones up. But the most recent one, Epoch or the Esotericon, there's none of this Superman business in there. It's basically a grimoire of actual gods until you get to the space ones, and then it's the Necronomicon stuff in there. And so I don't know. It gets people glance at it, and the other thing that happens is the same thing, funnily enough, that happens to Wicca. People have all been through their chaos magic phase, and they're maybe a little bit ashamed of themselves in it. But eventually, chaos magic is kind of like Atlanta Airport. It's not a place you stay, but it's a place that gets you to somewhere else. And some of the best magicians I know have all had their chaos magic phase, and as a result of it, have landed on the thing that really works for them and has really resonated with them. For me, the airport apparently resonates.
Well, and then you're talking about the Apollo workings and the Superman. Are those specific type of exercises or rituals that you perform and it gets you to a certain mental state or spiritual status?
Well, it could be. I mean, I haven't done them. I actually haven't ever been really that interested in Superman, but yeah, like it could be that you would find. I mean, I remember them from the kind of dial-up IRC days of the internet, where people would be swapping rituals that would use, instead of a wand, one is just burned into the back of my head, right? And I thought that's just not worth anyone's time. But it was a ritual that, instead of a wand, used like a plastic light-up version of. Do you remember the villain from the Aladdin movie, Jafar?
Oh yeah,
and he had that snake staff.
Oh yeah,
it was like one of them. Like, use that, and I'm like, I'm probably not going to do that. So, by virtue of its kind of experimental structure, the sort of digital footprint of chaos magic has a lot of silliness. So I mean, I wouldn't speak, if I haven't done them, I wouldn't speak to anyone else necessarily doing them. But for me, it was a worldview that allowed experimentation and intellectual exploration. But from an actual, operant magical perspective, I'm sort of reasonably conservative. It's an animist spirit model for the most part.
Now, you said that the chaos magic has no room for error. You either get results or you don't. So could you walk us through something that somebody that might want to go down that path and want to see results, that they could perform in their house or somewhere to actually give them an opportunity to see what it's all about?
Yeah. The simplest thing, I mean, because we'll just talk through it now, but in the sort of 6 or 7 year history of, it's more than that now, of runesoup.com, the most popular page ever is called Sigils Reboot, and it's had millions of visits. And it kind of steps you through from beginning to end my process of sigil magic, or what is called sigil magic in chaos magic in particular. Once you get into these things, it's very inside baseball, and so you'll have people in sort of a more Golden Dawn tradition sort of saying, well, that's not, the Austin Spare model isn't the only sigils, there are sigils and grimoires and blah, blah, blah. And that's all true. However, when we're talking about sigil magic, we're talking about a very specific one here. And that one's fairly simple, because you just kind of build multiple intentions rather than a single one with, letters on a piece of paper, and you cross them out, and you cross out the doubles and the vowels, and you turn them into some kind of pictogram that you then subsequently, activate. The innovations I guess I would have brought to this would be what's called the shoaling method, which is making sure you sort of activate more than one at a time, and also to include what I call the robofish, which is a sigil for something that has either already happened or that you are 100% certain will happen. So I will have spaghetti for supper. And that appears to dramatically increase the preferred probabilistic outcomes. And as to why, that's very interesting, because you're kind of sort of playing a game of semaphore with your unconscious, if you want to use like a non-magical or a sort of monoculturally accepted view of what's going on. That's probably not even close to the whole story, but we can go with it for the purposes of description. So you're kind of communicating with your unconscious. That was Austin Spare, the early 20th century London artist's idea behind a lot of the stuff he did that has been absorbed and become sigil magic in chaos magic, because he had this notion that the unconscious mind doesn't understand lack. And so you give it this idea, and the trick is to get it past your conscious mind, which does, and it's where all your fears and anxieties are. It's important to remember that at the time, Europe was particularly interested in the ideas of like Jung and Freud. These are the early days of psychology. So the sort of models of the human mind were quite unsophisticated. But out of that lack of sophistication came some very interesting magical technology, for want of a better word. So I would recommend people do the sigil thing, because it's actually, I have two recommendations. If people, the thing is, magic isn't for everyone, and if you haven't found it by now, it's probably not for you. That seems to be how people are interested in it, and they'll dabble and do sigils. But there might be people listening to this who are like, this is so absolutely for me. I didn't actually realize that there were people out there who were only semi-insane who consider themselves magicians. And if that's the case, then you need to have some kind of triggering event. Like different orders have initiations, but that's not really it. That's kind of the ceremony after the graduation. You need some kind of event. And most people have already had them. It can be anything. You can live in a haunted house. You can be abducted by aliens. You can have something that will permanently and irrevocably make the universe bigger for you. And funnily enough, the sigil thing, if people try that, because the results manifest through a series of like increasingly improbable synchronicities, you do that a few times. You sort of shoal through a few shoals of sigils. And it's sort of 4 or 5 weeks later, and you're living in a very, very different universe, because it is far more malleable than you previously realized. So that can be the inciting event, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. It's quite good, because the thing you learn, why sigil magic is such a good, dare I say, beginner process, is that it has multiple learnings. So it's not just you learn that magic works, but you actually learn what to enchant for and what not to, because so much of it is the high volume setting, like actually writing down your intentions. So you kind of nail down the things you can and can't move, and you have to do that at scale if you're shoaling, because you need between 5 and 10 sigils each time. And so there's an almost weight training element to it that I don't think people value as highly as they should. But yeah, beginners, sigils, if you just Google rune soup sigils, it's the first thing that comes up, and there's a beginning to end process for you there.
Now, when you do these sigils, are you sometimes, doing them at nighttime as you're about to go to sleep, and just continuing to chant as you fall asleep? Or, are you doing it in the morning when you get up, during lunch breaks? Does it really matter?
I've done all of them. It's that kind of combination of available resources and available time, and so when I tend to like to do them either very, very early in the morning after a fast day. Like I do intermittent fasting because it's like free drugs. You get the most amazing dreams on fast days. And there's probably something to that in a kind of wider consciousness model. This is perhaps a very good example of the kind of things chaos magicians interest themselves in. So I do them in the mornings. I like to have two options. I like to have a completely clear head. So no food, not full. I'm clean. I have my kind of upstairs home office / magician workroom. And I do that here. But by the same token, I have any number of times activated them under, mild entheogens. You end up testing all these things out. Let's see what happens if I activate some sigils on rum, on LSA, or, whatever.
Right.
And you end up finding your own way of doing it, which was the point. That's kind of the chaos magic point. You need to find the things that allow you to optimize all the worlds, and the pieces of them vary from magician to magician.
And you were talking about different gods, different archetypes. Have you actually harnessed those energies? Have you tapped into different god forms throughout your uh, experiences, and been able to bring something back that you can say without a shadow of a doubt was just, it was absolutely real, 100%?
Yeah, I mean, depends what you mean by bring back. So I don't know if you've ever had any DMT analogs like ayahuasca, but if you get that right, there's really no there's really no getting the toothpaste back into the tube after that. That you're aware that these realms. Well, you're aware of two things. Either your understanding of your head is woefully inadequate because it contains an entire universe filled with actual separate entities, or, which seems more likely, the universe is filled with entirely separate spirit entities. So I kind of have landed on a. I mean, this is such a politically contentious word, but everyone knows what I mean when I say it. I've landed on a more shamanic or animistic process where there's a lot of dream work involved and a lot of dream journeying, rather than going and bringing specific things back. But I mean, that was the stuff I was testing in the 90s for me. So, as I said, 90s, Sydney, Australia, working in the music industry. So, going out to invoking Dionysus before you take the MDMA, and going out and seeing what would happen, and kind of in that American God sense, dedicating the evening to him. And you end up in the most, I don't know whether you would call it bringing things back, but my most exciting one of them was ending up at an after party in Bondi with a drug dealer who worked for the UN so that he could just walk anything into the country because it's a diplomatic passport, who owned a
Right.
mine that had some kind of glow in the dark rocks that they hadn't found a commercial use for them yet. So he got it for nothing. So we're sitting there, I'm talking to this guy who works for the UN who literally just walked like a carry-on bag of drugs into the country the day before. And there's some woman who's like obviously still very high. She's kind of dancing in that sort of weird Fred Astaire camera trick way up the side of the walls. And this is not my usual Sunday morning. And it was the one before that. And that's when you realize, there is something to this. It's unpredictable. So one of the things that gets you from beginning to sort of proficiency in magic is to work with that unpredictability. You can't just, it's not writing a letter to Santa. You can't be like, "Dear Apollo, may I have these things? Sincerely, Rex." It Whatever is going on with these processes doesn't conform to our understanding of predictability. And again, that's another thing you learn if you do the shoaling stuff, because you sort of learn by getting the results you want in a really dickish and unhelpful way that you can't explain any other way. And you just have dozens of them over the course of a magical career. And you have that flash of insight. Oh shit, I should have been pointing in it slightly to the right of the target that I was going after. But so the universe is responding, and you're essentially building up a language or a way of communicating with it.
When you talk about the DMT experiences, I've spoken with several people that have had DMT and ayahuasca, or how do you pronounce that?
Ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca, thank you. And they've told me that it was almost like they saw a gray extra, like what you would think of as an ET, the typical gray. And I've talked to other people that have taken salvia, which is actually legal at a lot of places here in America. I mean, you can just go to a head shop and buy it, and they have totally different experiences, but both spiritual. Now, the DMT is called the God particle for a reason, I think, because I've heard it's just a very enlightening experience. But most people that I've talked to that have done salvia say it's almost like a hellish experience where they get brought into the earth almost, but more of inside of a demonic archetype that they can't leave or do anything unless they're allowed to. So have you ever done salvia, and do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, I have. Mine's kind of like of a similar type to that. My salvia experiences, which I know I've spoken about this on the blog a few times, and other people who are regular users say I have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm like, well, that's what happened to me. But I had a kind of cartoon Mayan lizard men situation. So it was sort of a Mayan-ish cityscape, but instead of Mayans, I had kind of like lizard people, and it was intense. It was brief as well, but it was intense, and it wasn't pleasant. It was interesting, so it wasn't unpleasant. I'd had some, experiences with a whole bunch of different entheogens and just general magical path working, which doesn't necessarily involve drugs and so on. So I guess I was genuinely interested. But that earth or the kind of chthonic aspect, mine looks like that, but it was kind of dark greens. Like the buildings were outlined in green, sort of like a line drawing, like almost like a crayon line drawing of the landscape, but there were lizard people. So it was dark and it was green and it was earth, and I would consider that to be a similar type to the descriptions that you've had, because it wasn't pleasant. Depending on how you consume DMT, it's a rush. It's a very intense experience, but it's not necessarily benign. It kind of feels right or expected when you're doing it. Salvia is different. Salvia is an intrusion or a peak, and I suspect it's because we're getting it wrong. If I look at the sort of motifs I saw and the kind of distribution of the psychoactive parts of the Salvia family, they do sort of correlate to Central America. And Central American cultures, they still do, but like historically have used a whole bunch of different molecules for these kind of journeys, more mushroom based in general. But I got the sense that there's a way to use this that I'm not really, that I don't know what it is. Entheogens, you're just taking drugs if you're not doing it in the right way, which is fine if that's what you want to do with your life. But if you're doing it in a suitably ritualized and serious way, then they have the potential to kind of give you these experiences. Otherwise, you're just taking drugs. And in the case of Salvia, I mean, I did try to ritualize it in the sense that I, made a space for it and, had a clear mind. I didn't sort of wander into a car park beside a gas station and get high. It was done in a very specific way. But I came away from it realizing or suspecting that I don't have the keys to make this car drive correctly.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's just certainly a completely different mindset than what you're talking about, DMT or magic mushrooms per se. And yeah, I mean, I can see why the shamans would use those specific tools to that they had access to, because it certainly will stimulate different parts of your mind. I've talked to people that say it's best to get there naturally, and it probably is in the long run. But I mean, there's just
it depends what you mean by naturally. I mean, mushrooms are naturally occurring. I would agree
that they are absolutely.
It's the same thing. I would agree. I have never smoked DMT. I have a bunch of friends who do, but I probably wouldn't. I don't think that's the way that's supposed to be used. I think that's the case. I don't do any of these synthetic. I don't really take that many drugs, but I don't do any of these synthetic monstrosities coming out of China now.
Right.
But by the same token, I think mushroom and weed should be completely legal because they're naturally occurring. But I agree in the sense that that's the best way to do it in the right environment. My preferred or my favorite of any of these molecules is psilocybin, because you can actually take it recreationally and have a good time. If you're used to it, don't do it, in a house full of strangers at a house party where you don't know anyone. But I've been to Amsterdam a few times, so you can recreationally, it's legal there, or at least the truffles are. And so you can consume them and it's just have a night out, and it's quite fun. But by the same token, you can do them in a ritualized context. So I don't agree that... I don't think there's anything at all wrong, and it's ahistoric to suggest it, that you should get to these spiritual states without the use of drugs. That's a kind of internalized Victorian prudish way of seeing the world. And it's ahistorical, because if you go and ask an Amazonian shaman to do his or her job without ayahuasca, and they won't. You can't. Like it's. I think Terence McKenna said it's like asking a pilot to not have a plane. Like they're not a shaman
Right.
if they don't have the plane. So I think a lot of that comes from people who are probably trying to sell a yoga weekend or something. But it's ahistorical. Again, this comes back to magic is not for everyone. I've never met a shaman who has chosen shamanism. It's been the spirits choosing them, and I'm glad they haven't chosen. Like it's not a pleasant life. So yeah, I'm not.
Are you a shaman?
Maybe God no.
No.
Thank God. Honestly, the ones that I've met, it's not something you're kind of you're chosen for a healing role, and not in a nice way, not in a like, oh, it's a spa weekend way. You're chosen to heal very damaged people of very profound things. And it, if you look back over the historical record, these are the ones. Let's be clear. Regular consumption of, some of these chemicals, which are partially poisonous, because that's what the molecules in the plants were for, as defense in many cases anyway. So if your job is to sort of take a small amount of poison every day for the good of a tribe, you're not going to live very long. You're going to have a sore stomach your entire life. But that's the job. Like, you don't get a choice in it.
Well, that makes sense too. I mean, there's probably ways to tap into some of the abilities that shamans have with practices and exercises, but a true shaman, like you said, is chosen via spirits because of, the way that they were created before birth or whatever. So that's an incredible way to look at it, and I'm really glad that you kind of went down that route. I appreciate that. One of the things, too, that I was hoping we could talk about, because you certainly have a really cool lineage, and just your life has been, incredible. I'm reading from Scarlet Imprint, that's your publisher, great publishing company. And in their bio of you, it says, Gordon is no basement mage. He is a success in many spheres, working for some of the world's largest digital and social media companies, in a life that few experience. He's partied with princes, dined in castles, been mentioned by former directors of a private spy agency, and had a billionaire knight buy him a bottle of champagne. So that's awesome, man. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, is this billionaire someone like Richard Branson? Or
it was Richard Branson.
Oh, it was? Yeah. Bingo.
Remember? Yeah, I used to work for Virgin Music, so it was Richard Branson. It just sounds better when you say billionaire knight.
Oh yeah, that's perfect, man. That was a cool guess there. So now, can I ask about the private spy guy, the spook?
Not really. It's so I've had the last 8 years have been in career in sort of startup and media across Europe, which has meant that I've been accidentally useful to some like really rich and odd people on Europe and in the UK. And one of the guys one of the people involved several startups back. So my sort of boss's boss, who I got quite friendly with, he's had jobs where you've sort of had to resell old military technology. I mean, it happened in the US, police departments are buying tanks and stuff that are sort of military surplus.
Oh yeah, it's retarded.
From a government perspective, there's a lot of communications technology that's now no longer strategically useful. So it's sort of the stuff that Q Branch no longer wants if you watch James Bond films.
Oh, yeah.
And some of them, and this is in the early 90s, some of them, the stuff that, I know from previous episodes of your show, Rex, it's a direction, I'm prepared to go in, but I've met people like this so these, the stuff that this guy was working on in the early 90s was selling things that are sort of radar dishes that can sort of see through walls, like handheld radar dishes, which we know now are things that can happen. It's sort of like a much more sensitive heat sensor, but it's essentially an X-ray vision gun, right? But that's for sale because they no longer need it 25 years ago in Britain. So let's wind the clock forward to 2016 and go to a country with a military budget that is literally 10 to 15 times the UK's. And so if the UK didn't need that 25 years ago, what kind of toys are we talking about? So we would chat about that. It was the people at that level were fascinating because I think a lot of the shortcomings of conspiratainment analysis is the people involved very often don't have much experience being around powerful people. So I remember there was a reunion of the startup I was working for. It was a perfectly innocuous thing. It was a sort of like a German version of Yelp, you know.
Okay.
So it wasn't anything, it wasn't tricksy, or it was just like a social media business. It was fantastic. It was probably the best job I ever had. But we had some catch-up drinks, and I think it was a day or two after the Boston bombings. And so the night was getting on, and I was drunk, and people were talking about it because that was obviously the big story in the news. And I'm like, it's a fucking op, which, you know, it is.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up.
And the guy I mentioned, or the guy who's mentioned in my bio, was like, yeah, of course it is. And he said it. So he woke up in the morning, turned on the TV, saw that, and said to himself, up, and went about his business. He's not in on the conspiracy or anything, but when you're around powerful people, they're not uniformly responsible for all these things that are going on, but they're aware that they do go on. So he actually has a piece of information, which is, this is an op. Doesn't know, he doesn't even need to know. Like, we get obsessed with it in that kind of OCD way. He doesn't need to know what it is. He just needs to know that the official story is not what actually happened, and whether or not that impacts, you know, what he's doing over the next 6 months. And in the case of the Boston bombings, because he's based in Europe, it obviously didn't. But that was a real insight to me, that these people at a very senior level can turn on the TV, and the stuff that, you know, we would rail about, going, this is an op, or this is bullshit, or we fund ISIS, or what have you. They know all that. We're the ones yelling about it. They know about it. They just kind of change their trajectory accordingly. And that was a very good lesson for me, to realize that, you know, quite what are we yelling about
Right.
when we bring this stuff up? Because once you've worked out it is not what it seems, what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point too. And, you know, I like how you say it's just the way it is. He can see it right away. I'm sure you can as well when you turn on the TV, and if you see a false flag operation that takes place, the way that the media spins it, it's real easy to spot out. When that Boston Marathon smoke bombing session took place, there was so much evidence to prove it was a staged event. And then when CNN goes on and says that 100 and something people had their legs blown off during the Boston smoke bombings, it almost makes you want to vomit, because people actually believe that kind of stuff. And then people want to go out and, you know, make it illegal to buy a crock pot because that's supposedly how they did it. Yeah. I mean, it's just like, wake up. You know, it's just unbelievable.
I think, so for me, what was interesting was, like, this guy I'm talking about, he's not going to visit conspiracy sites and work out who said what. He probably, I mean, I wouldn't even go so far as to say false flag. You can actually just look at it and go, is this real, or is this an op? Like, and beyond op, you have your sort of best guesses as to, well, is this a classic false flag? Is it these people? Is it, I mean, my read of the Boston bombing situation is that it was some assets gone rogue. So I wouldn't even use the false flag there, but he doesn't care. And that was the bit that fascinated me. It's like, he turned on the TV and it's like, this is the news. Is it real or is it not? He went with a not, and kind of went about his life as a result. And I've kind of internalized that. I mean, I find this stuff interesting and very useful from the point of view of life forecasting. So we know certain things have been trial ballooned, like banning of physical money and all that kind of stuff that's kind of coming down the pipe in the next few years. That's very important information to dig deep on, because that's going to affect you. That's going to affect everyone. So that was like an eye-opener for me, that someone who's worked not in like a proper sort of, not for MI6 or anything like that. It's just that he'd been on the edge of this world for long enough to know that this is the kind of shenanigans they get up to. So he turns on the TV, and is it shenanigans or not? Makes the call and goes on with his life. And that really stuck with me.
Right. And you look at people around the world, and you know, everybody has a different childhood and the way that they're raised, politics, media, school, etc. So their lifestyle is completely different on the other side of the world. So, you know, when there's the media spins Americans as just these gun-toting, SUV driving, you know, Coors Light, beer drinking, cowboy hat wearing, you know, gunslingers, and really that's not the case. I mean, there's a lot of people out here that are like that, but there's some very well educated individuals, and I think that the problem is, even if all of the guns, were taken out of people's hands, the citizens' hands, there's so much on the black market that there would be a lot more people that were actually robbed and killed because of the black market guns, because it's not the people that have the legal right to own them. But, I know that the UK, it's very difficult to have a gun out there, even if you are a police officer. And, there's not as many shootings, but there's a lot more stabbings and other ways to kill people.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with guns. I'm definitely not in that kind of leftist gun confiscating camp, and mostly because I get very suspicious when it's the trial balloon thing, when you start to see the reasons. If these events were real, so if Sandy Hook was as it seemed, you could make the case that you'd have to potentially look at, well, what is our gun law situation, because this has just happened. But when two things happen, which is Sandy Hook is not at all what it seems, and you have these kind of globalist mouthpieces calling for gun control. And when those two things happen at the one time, that's an example of, okay, so now we need to prick up areas and listen to maybe what's going on here, because you now have two pieces of something and you don't have the other pieces, and you need to be suspicious. But in general, I'm fairly left libertarian about the whole thing, private gun ownership to, I don't know, protect your marijuana stash from some recently married gays. It's all fine. It's all good. That tends to be where I land on it.
Yeah. And that's the whole other subject and everything. But so the people that you've met in your life, I mean, you've seen some amazing things and been to some amazing places. And that's what's, I think, helped you put together this incredible book that has just so much data from around the world that you've compiled. And, I'd like to get into that in a minute here, because just it's fascinating. But let's go back to some of the magic here and the abilities that one might have that has been able to harness some of the energies and such. Like a typical day for you, Gordon, when you wake up, get ready for the day and stuff like that, do you set aside a certain amount of time each day to perform certain mental exercises and visualization exercises or whatever to manifest your reality?
Rex, I would love to say yes. Most magicians out there kind of fall into two camps. There's the ones who lie about doing something on a daily basis, and then there are the people who don't lie about doing something on a daily basis. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is not always. There are moments you'd be surprised. I commute via bus into central London, and I get up way early because it's just how I'm wired. So I have these very nice, it's almost like a pageant trip into town, because you go through Notting Hill, past Kensington Palace, along the top of Hyde Park, Oxford Street, you turn right onto Regent Street and down into Piccadilly Circus, and you get off there. You could charge tourists £40 for this commute. And so I can sit up on the top level of the red London buses and either use a Headspace app or kind of a shamanic drumming app. They have terrible names, but the one I use is called Shaman Magic. And it's quite good because you can set the different beats per minute and the background sounds from rain, water, or what have you. And you can kind of use this as white noise and either do it as breathing exercises or whatever kind of energy body exercises you're doing. And you're otherwise just going to fill that space with nothing. So that one happens fairly often. If it's a work from home day, it's generally a bit more involved, but frankly, not a lot. I mean, I don't use the phone in that case because I'm in here with my own supplies, and so I've got incense and all that kind of thing. And I would love to say it happens on a daily basis. It doesn't, but it should. When you're talking about kind of 20 years in, you end up with kind of like your own X-Men team. So there are beings or spirits or whatever you want to call them that you have fairly fruitful relationships with. They like you and you like them. This, funnily enough, suggests there is a deep structure to magic, because the exact same thing is found in sort of animist cultures that have either shamans or witch doctors or so on. They have familiars, and they have certain spirits or beings in the spirit world that they work with, that you either find via a vision quest, as you'll get in the First Nations people, or what have you. The sort of Western European version of that, more often than not, emerges out of the grimoire tradition. So when I have all those kind of toys to hand, I do them here. But it's not like you're doing something very wrong if your life is an emergency on a daily basis that requires like daily practical magic. Because there's not that many categories of practical magic. They basically fall into sex, money, power. So, are you in a relationship that you're happy with or not? Or if you're single, do you want to get lucky that night? So that's the kind of sex one covered. And now, I'm in a very long-term monogamous relationship. So, sex is off the table anyway. But then you get to like the money and power ones. And again, if you've got a job you like, we could all have more money, but you learn as well that the more you push on things with stuff that the spirit world doesn't understand, such as, global currency systems, when you're talking to a being that may well be 10,000 years old, don't push it, because it's not their area of expertise. It would be like if I gave you a scalpel, Rex, and kind of, pushed you into a theater to do minor surgery, like say, take out that kid's appendix. And if you don't, I'll kill you. Then you probably would. And if you're lucky, if the nurse is good, you won't kill the child. But it will not go that way. It'll be a very crude operation. So you have to really take a few steps back if you're doing kind of emergency magic on a daily basis. So the sort of need for, well, what do you do on a daily basis kind of goes away beyond the sort of offerings or just general checking in spirit contact that you would ordinarily do to kind of maintain good extra dimensional relations. So, and even that is often not on a daily basis. There are, looking back through the books, depending on what your own X-Men team looks like, it seems to me quite important that the ones that land on a specific day, because each day of the week has, a planet associated with it, and the planets do tend to clump together certain classes of spirits and that kind of thing. So as long as if it's Astaroth, as long as you're kind of checking in on a Friday, that's quite good as a maintenance thing. But yeah, no, it's the thing about, and it's kind of 120 years of bad press, maybe 500 years of bad press. This idea that practical magic is some kind of wisdom tradition. It's not. It's not the goal of it. It's never been the goal of it. Like the grimoire tradition is kind of like a early modern English middle class version of witchcraft. It's there for the same reason hoodoo is there. Usually because people are just built that way and naturally have a need or a compulsion to engage with the spirit world, but it's there for optimizing of life. Like if you're after some sort of a spiritual apotheosis, you would struggle to find a worse route to that than magic. Literally anything else. Just meditate for 20 minutes a day for a couple of years, and you will be so far ahead in this goal than even quite proficient magicians, because it's not really what it's about. I know that's unpopular amongst people who are in different orders, because they've kind of built themselves this sort of fake Masonic version where they give each other certificates as they move up the ranks. But historically it's never been that. That's not what we find in the archaeological record. Shamanism wasn't a wisdom tradition. It was a triage medical function. And it's the same thing if you look at witch doctors or hoodoo women or actual witches in the early medieval period, or like early modern period rather. it's it's not that. It's curing cattle of ringworm and finding a woman stupid enough to marry your feckless son. Like it's that kind of day to day. It's a deeper engagement with the physical world rather than a quest for the non-physical, if that makes sense.
It does. And another thing that, in my opinion, has given magic or the occult a really bad rap is the Abrahamic religions. You know, the Bible. I mean, it's just and not even necessarily the Bible, but just pastors and preachers and people that are, I guess you could say, uneducated. They really push to their congregation that if you practice any form of magic, then you're part of the Antichrist and you're going to spend an eternity in hell burning, you know, and it's just it's really unfortunate. And I wonder if maybe that was done by design, if religion is a form of control to keep the masses docile so that select people that are awake and do know the abilities that they have can, you know, kind of be godlike in a sense.
Yeah, potentially. I would. When that happens, it's a localized effect. So you sort of get that. You obviously get that with the rise of Catholicism, but you got that with the sort of politics of occupied Judea as well. So you had certain local noble families or families associated with the temple doing things that to be in power requires control of information. And so you certainly get localized effects of that the whole way through. For instance, for basically up until James the First, people didn't massively care about witchcraft in Britain or even sort of Western Europe or the Iberian Peninsula. It was kind of looked down upon as a peasant activity, but people needed it. Like there was no one else to go to when your kid was sick or your chicken stopped laying or what have you. It fulfilled a sociological function. But James the First, who was James the Fourth of Scotland, he became king of the United Kingdom when Elizabeth I died. But he grew up in Scotland and was raised by women who fed him all these stories about like Scottish ghost stories. So he was scared of witchcraft and magic. And then when he was heading across to Denmark to pick up his wife or future wife, they had to turn back because there was a storm, and they had to turn back once they got the wife, I think twice back to Denmark. And somebody told him that it was like witches trying to prevent the marriage. So he comes into London. He's the first and only monarch to ever write like a book on demonology. He's like, all right, so here's what they do. Here's what you need to watch out for. And it was by then, witchcraft or the old religion got mixed up with all the remaining Catholics up in that sort of in the hinterlands of a country that had only recently become Protestant and was terrified of Catholic Europe. So it is a different conversation each time, but the shape of the dialectic is the same, which is the powerful are controlling a vision of the less powerful, and it changes how that goes along. Like the hellfire stuff doesn't happen in Europe, but that kind of ecstatic version of Christianity is a singular American phenomenon that doesn't really match how Christianity in the East or Western churches works. This idea that you kind of publicly declare Jesus your Lord and Savior, and then any old moron can hang out their shingle, that's American. Like you can't do that in Eastern Orthodox or Catholic or even Anglican tradition. The rituals of the church are built by people who understood the typology of the Old Testament and read the church fathers, and the pieces that are in it are there for very specific magical ritual reasons, which is all kind of discarded in that idea that in the very American cultural sense of some kind of saying something loud in public and then forever expressing your opinion. But unfortunately, that's done a lot of damage to the cultural piece. But by the same token, I don't care. Like it's not for everyone. I don't care what people think. Most people who are quite good at it don't, nor do they publicly advertise it, because it's never been. Practical magic is not a viable universal worldview. And that's what I mean by I don't think if you haven't found it yet, if a person hasn't really found it yet, and they're not listening to this in a state of like constant tingling, like, holy shit, this is real, then, dabble all you want. It's your consciousness, but it tends to find you, and magicians can kind of recognize the real in that sense, and all the nonsense elsewhere. People, saying that Dick Cheney's a Thelemite and all this is just crap. But you won't ever convince people on the internet's mind about anything anyway, and certainly not something like that, which isn't to say there isn't ritual components to 9/11, but that I'm telling you Dick Cheney is not a fucking Thelemite. And it's that a lot of this analysis is undertaken by people without a kind of lived experience of how magic works and how ritual magic and public acts of it would work. So yeah, it's the game. It's always been the game. Peter Carroll of Scarlet Imprint says you find the witch at the end of the pointed finger. And that's a very good definition, I think, of witchcraft. It's not some kind of earth goddess survival, because it's not that in other cultures. It was never that in Europe. But around the world, you find the witch at the end of the pointed finger. It's the magic that is not condoned by the power structure.
Well, and Thelmites, I mean, the Book of Thelema by Aleister Crowley isn't the main overall principle of somebody that considers himself a Thelmite. Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will.
Yeah, that's kind of what he boiled down the experience that he had in Egypt into, kind of, his, let's try to make this as simple as possible. He did that a few ways, because funnily enough, it never seemed to take off. He had these spirits telling him he was a prophet of the new eon, and yet he's still, I'm fascinated by Aleister Crowley. I think he's a really interesting, and he was an intelligent guy. But yeah, so
can I jump in real quick with Aleister Crowley?
Sure.
Because obviously, he certainly did have an impact on society. Even today's many of the people in the entertainment industry, the music industry, Hollywood, are really gung-ho towards Aleister Crowley. And he was a fascinating individual. I've read several of his works. And at first, when I first started researching him, the books that I read, it just didn't make sense. It was way over my head. But the more research I did and the more opportunity I had to digest it, now it's a lot more understandable for me. Multifaceted for sure. But do you think that when he supposedly did that automatic writing via was it the Book of the Law or the Book of Thought?
Well, no, it was the Book of the Law. That's what he got as a result of which I go into in Starships. But
do you think that's legit? Do you think?
Yeah,
of
course.
Okay.
So if again, it's in Starships, there's a reasonable amount devoted to it, and why I think that particularly worked, given his prior experience in Egypt, because this was his second trip coming back through. And interesting stuff happens. I don't know how much Jacques Vallée you've read, but the experience of the reception of the Book of the Law falls into a type that we would now associate with like a UFO abduction, right up to and including starting what is effectively a UFO cult, because there was astronomical
I was
and the whole general, there's a star goddess, there's Iwas, there's all these pieces in it. But before, so you had a string of extreme synchronicities that happened at he called it the Cairo Museum, and going out to dinner with his wife, and her saying that Horus was angry, and the name of the waiter, and all these things. I don't know if you've had this experience, Rex, of trying to describe a sequence of synchronicities to someone, and when you describe them, they sound like shit. Like the person's like, that doesn't sound like it's that interesting, or a synchronicity. But you know damn well it is, because that's just kind of how they work.
Right.
So he had a string of these things, and he had a string of these things while there was an eclipse and weird shit happened with Venus. So you have the atmospheric effects going on that are associated with a UFO event. And then he gets, over the course of 3 days, a channeled text from beings in space, effectively. Now, if that had happened in the 50s, that would have been like some kind of George Adamski situation. So, yes, I do like to say I think there is a reality behind the experience that Aleister Crowley had in Egypt during the reception of the Book of the Law is a very different thing to saying I subscribe to the Book of the Law. I think that was a real and legitimate contact with extra-dimensional beings. And as over the last 110 years or so, we've now had about a dozen of them that have reached popular consciousness that, and you could include Whitley Strieber in this, of a kind of extra dimensional event associated with the stars, and then a whole follow-up series of books that went on to change culture over a sort of slow burn way. This is what I mean by, if you read Jacques Vallée, suddenly Crowley, with all his faults, became you kind of, how to describe this, Crowley kind of re-elevates in your eyes when that happens, not because you think he's clever or any of that stuff, but he was a fascinating man because in many senses he was extremely arrogant, and he couldn't get this experience out of his head. So he lived for 40-something years after it. And if you look at what happened prior to, he kind of tiptoes, or really more tears through a whole bunch of different magical systems. He does Enochian, he does Kabbalah, like tears through the Golden Dawn curriculum and the Goetia and all this kind of thing, and then kind of gets over it. But this stuck in his head, and he tried to kind of, he did other things. So he would go out in the desert and do the Enochian stuff and what have you, in between receiving the Book of the Law and dying. But he couldn't quite escape in that same way that a Travis Walton or a UFO experiencer can't ever quite escape constantly reanalyzing what happened. You see that, and his understanding of it became more and more mature. So at first he ignored it as garbage, then he thought he was the prophet of the new eon. But when you read the writings when he was in Netherwood, which I've been to, it's the sort of old folks' home a bit south of London, where he spent his last days. And he's sending letters to people, and he's sending angry ones to people around Jack Parsons, but he's sending nice ones and chatting to a guy called Kenneth Grant. And he'd sort of mellowed and realized that whilst the experience was real, the key takeaway is that these beings are real. So there are extra-dimensional beings that are associated with the stars that are here to teach mankind or to elevate mankind in some way, and that it's essential to our progress as a species that we engage with that. And that's where he landed. So everyone says that you can, because he wrote prolifically for decades. So on the kind of more lurid corners of the conspiratainment world, you will find him saying something about the Jews or black people or whatever, and he certainly wrote them down. But if you get to the guy at the end of his life, you see someone who uses the I Ching, who's kind of retired and realized that after a very vigorous and inspiring youth, he ended up a mystic by accident, put it that way, a drug addicted mystic, but a whole bunch of them are. So he's far more complicated than I think people think when they sort of extract quotes of his from mid-career.
Well, if anybody's ever read his books, I mean, I don't know how they could possibly think that, because, I mean, it's very intellectual, and his dialect is just absolutely incredible. And that was such a long time ago. It seemed like it was so multifaceted that, I still don't know if I'm grasping 30% of what he put out there. But Jimmy Page was a big fan of Aleister Crowley, and they bought the old house in Loch Ness that Aleister Crowley used to live at, and that's where they came up with the song Stairway to Heaven, which was supposedly automatic writing when he was in some seance. And if you play that song backwards, it's pretty creepy. Have you heard that song backwards?
Yeah, I have. I have some people in common, because you say Jimmy was a fan. He's still a fan of Aleister Crowley, and he has one of the best Crowley, original Crowley and Austin Spare libraries in the world, which he doesn't ever really let people see. You have to be pretty good friends with him. And yeah, the house in question was Boleskine House, and I've been. I haven't been inside, but I've been to the house. It burned down recently, and it's an eerie place. Loch Ness is an eerie place,
Right.
and so you kind of put a wizard in this house where he then sort of worked his way through a list of 72 spirits, so the demons of the Goetia.
Lesser Keys of Solomon.
Yeah. So it's a spirit list and a way of attracting them, and he went through that on on the edge of a lake that has had a monster legend associated with it since about 600 AD. So there are stories of early Celtic Christian saints essentially subduing with the sign of a cross monsters in the Loch Ness area that you think, oh, that's so it wasn't an early 20th century photography hoax. The story goes back 1600 years. It's obviously not a dinosaur either. You're once again in that Fortean extra dimensional space where it's what John Keel would have called a window area. And I've had picnics along Loch Ness, and it's weird. You kind of know when it's time to go. Stunning country, like it makes your face melt. It's beautiful, but it also gets creepy quite quickly.
Right.
So I'm not surprised that Stairway to Heaven was automatic writing in that way. Jimmy Page is the real deal when it comes to the practice of magic. But as you say, like 20th century, here's what I think happened when the spirits called in the prophet of a new eon. He thought that meant some kind of Jesus or Krishnamurti role. But again, this is why you got to be careful asking spirits for things like money. They don't really understand it. Because if you're a being that has a different relationship to time than we do, that's what he would look like. Because here's this, bisexual mountain climber from sort of north of Birmingham. And if you look at the timeline, so the second half of the 20th century, it sort of spins out into the Beatles and rock music and counterculture and spies and MK Ultra and all this. So you kind of look at him sideways. You look at him sideways in time, and it looks like a funnel in water from this one particular point. And so from their perspective, he kind of was the prophet of a new eon, because what was the 20th century but the story of, spies and rock music, literally.
Now, Barbara Bush looks just like him, and there's a lot of speculation.
You're right.
So do you think that there's a connection there?
No. I've literally never heard that before, but she does. She does look quite like him.
It's crazy, man. And, once again, the internet is such a good place to be anyone and be able to do anything. I don't know if you saw that commercial where the guy says, bonjour. Anything's available on the internet. That's an American commercial, but this guy, basically this real ugly guy, picks up this this beautiful gal on the internet, and she's like, "I'm waiting to meet this guy that I talked to on the internet. Nobody can tell a lie on the internet. Everything on the internet's real. He's a French model," and he shows up and he goes, "Bonjour." You've got an X-Men of people. What are some of them like?
I haven't been asked that. They have their good and their bad points. Like humans, you end up. So I spent a reasonable amount of time in the Pacific growing up, because on the paternal side of the family, again, this is where a big part of the kind of impetus for Starships came from. So when you're dealing with indigenous cultures that have a spirit tradition or just animism in general, they speak of the spirits they work with the kind of frazzled, benign affection with which you would speak with a family member. So it has good and bad points. So without trying to name names, there's kind of a range of them. Some of them. Okay, I'll break it down this way. Spirits from the kind of Solomonic or Goetic grimoire line have a recognizable sense of humor. They're pleased by things that you would expect them to be pleased by. So they like high up places, a lot of them, which is odd for chthonic spirits in a way, but they like the promise or the idea of being noticed, or being celebrated, and as a result, you end up with a kind of, again, you'd have to talk to Andrea about this because I don't know a huge amount about voodoo, but you end up with a kind of like gay sense of humor, that kind of graveyard humor, which comes from kind of like almost psychopathic fun making, which is interesting, and that seems to be a personality type, at least for the ones I deal with, because there are some nasty ones in there. Let me be clear: like when people talk about working the grimoires, that doesn't mean you kind of play with them all. Some of them are nasty. Some of them are just not for me. Perhaps they think the same thing about me. I don't know. So that's interesting. You can kind of tell by a sort of mouthfeel personality component, and a sort of lack of understanding. Did you watch the Buffy spin-off show Angel?
I saw a part of an episode, yes.
Okay, no. So towards the end, there was a character called Illyria, which was a sort of walk-in of an old god into one of the main characters, and her attempts at humor and being around humans. It's actually quite well written when you think about it from that perspective. The saints I work with are a bit different because they're atypical, I guess. They're not like, I don't know. They're not like St. Francis of Assisi. They're not like animal lovers. I have a reasonable library of kind of Dark Age and Celtic saints. And when you get to the early history of the church, sainthood was easier to come by. You basically had to defend a village from the Vikings and then kind of die. And the miracles, the sort of posthumous miracles associated with you, had a lot to do with if you were buried near a well or if a spring sprang up somewhere near there, so that there was water associated with the burial area of someone highborn, and it kind of spun from there. So it's a kind of continuation of that Greek idea of the honored dead. The thing that's missing from a lot of order magic, but nowhere else in the world. So the glaring, face-meltingly obvious gap between the Western magical tradition up until about 5 years ago and literally the rest of the planet for all of recorded history is the prominence of the dead and the ancestors. So there's a lot of work at the moment in restoring them and working out how they fit within a Western magical tradition, and a big part of that comes down some specific saintly lines. So yeah, I hope that describes some of it without going into details I can't go into.
Sure. Now, do you believe in a duality in this universe? Like, do you believe in a supreme being of light and a supreme being of dark?
No. If I had to pin some worldview colors to the wall, I'm like I've sort of already mentioned. Mine is an animist model of the universe, which is that essentially everything has a spirit, including the entire thing, and that spirit is retained. Even so, certain objects can have it, and that spirit can be retained after the destruction of an object. You find this in Polynesian cultures where, effectively totem poles are destroyed, but the spirit within them retains. There's a strong undercurrent of animism along the Western magical tradition. So the Renaissance magicians were calling down spirits from different stars or planets into different talismans or pieces of art and so on. And that's a very animistic thing to do. It's a universe that's filled with spirits. And in terms of a supreme being, I think the animists are the best at this because they're the most humble. So, I mean, there's that sort of very 70s Navajo, misreading of a Navajo belief that there's the great mysterious. But in animist cultures, the attitude is, yes, there is probably a supreme God. He or she hasn't been around for a while. And if they were, how would they ever speak to us, or how would we ever discern what's going on? In the meantime, we appear to occupy a universe that is filled with spirits and a rich and impressive spirit world. And there are beings of different levels of complexity above and below humans that either we need to avoid or someone to engage with us, and so on. So they live in a much richer and more interesting universe. And do you know what? I think everyone is actually an animist without realizing it, because otherwise you're left with some very flimsy explanations about why certain houses don't feel right to you. Or I think it's something like approaching 80% of Americans have had some kind of after death communication with a relative, and you actually just listen to how our language is structured, and I think it is our natural state. I think this idea of living in a world of spirits, of forests, of rivers, of houses, of so on, is our. I mean, it was the worldview we've had for what, 190 of our 1,000 of our last 200,000 years. So it feels like that's the one for me in terms of any of that kind of Manichaean, Zoroastrian, supreme evil, supreme God. Now, these are much, much later layers to what I think is our natural belief system. And I have this theory, and this is literally, that's the story of starships. But I have this theory that, and it's odd for a chaos magician, but not really until you realize that we're trying to look for the most effective thing. Older in magic isn't necessarily better, but oldest might be. So if you look around the world, a famous 20th century anthropologist, Mircea Eliade, said that all creation myths are the story of a culture or a tribe trying to reconcile consciousness. So every creation myth is the story of mankind sort of awakening to self-awareness, because it is still the unanswered question, like, how that consciousness or self-awareness manages to exist as essentially a unique thing. And so we would have been asking, given that our brain is the same size, in fact, historically they were larger, for the last 200,000 years. So the same level of intelligence is asking these same questions, and that question is expressed in these creation myths. As to, it's expressed rather than answered, because that's the whole point. We've been we've been looking for the answer for 200,000 years, and so far no luck. So I'm not sure if there is an actual answer, but it's a kind of persistent recognition that is the question. That question of consciousness is the question.
And some people in some very high places. You've been all over the world, seen some amazing things. You're well versed in magic. Lucifer or Satan or the devil is so predominant in the media today. Many of the top entertainers and boast that they sold their soul to the devil, whether it be on Jimmy Kimmel Live or Conan O'Brien or a British TV show. And I wonder why. I mean, is that real? Is that a part of a ploy to sell more records? Or did they actually sign a blood contract and, put a prick in their finger and sign on the dotted line? What does that mean? What's your interpretation of that, Gordon?
Well, they may well have. So that there are a couple of jazz musicians at the beginning of jazz. I think Robert Johnson, the main one, who openly admitted that, who said he kind of wasn't a very good guitar player, and he went to the Crossroads 3 nights in a row and just played the guitar. And the third night, a large, sort of like literally a man in black, came up and sat next to him and tuned his guitar and walked off. And then he died 9 years or 11 years later. But when he was alive, he was the most remarkable guitarist. The thing is, he was black, obviously. This is before he moved to Chicago. We're talking in the South. When you're dealing with the devil, as discussed in cultures that have an Afro-Caribbean influence, the devil is a stand-in for something that isn't at all bad in a lot of the kind of African cultures that have subsequently influenced the rise of things like Santeria and voodoo and all those sort of Afro-Caribbean traditions, because it's the being at the crossroads that allows access into the entire world of the spirits. So when people say that, and everyone freaks out, there's a kind of weird sort of racist component in the background, because the devil is a cipher for the idea of some kind of agreement with the spirit world, which is literally what we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. It might be to know which valley the deer are running down so that, you know, your tribe can eat. It could be to be a good jazz musician. The pact thing, it appears to have some historical validity. The worship thing didn't. That's the whole point. This idea that you know, people are running around worshiping things. If you look at how early modern Europe saw the devil, and this is most noticeable on the Iberian Peninsula, but it's found in England and so on as well. The devil got his power by virtue of being the oldest thing on earth. So God created the devil. If you're like a cunning man in Essex, or like a folk witch in Portugal, here's how you see the world. God set the devil to rule the earth, and the devil knows everything, that has power over everything on earth because he is older than it. God created the angels before he created the earth, and then he set the devil to kind of run it. So if you have what is essentially a problem you need to solve, which can't necessarily be solved with herbalism or so on, the kind of where the buck stops is the devil. So he's retained in the sort of folk European tradition a lot of kind of trickster stuff that we see elsewhere in other, because let's never forget that European cultures were and are traditional cultures. So they have the trickster, they have these ideas. And the devil is kind of where a lot of these retained trickster stories come from, which is also where I think it correlates with a lot of UFO activity. Because you look at how villages would banish the devil, and they'd have to banish the devil because he was bothering their cattle. Now, surely Lucifer has better things to do than, bothering some Somerset cattle in the middle of the night. And so the devil becomes a storehouse for all these ideas rather than a being. And this is it. You only get this once again, you get to that kind of American version of it. But rather than a being that's kind of in some sort of eternal war with God to be king of the world, he's already king of the world. That's actually the kind of like traditional folk Christian view of it. So in that respect, people kind of clutch their pearls at something that, if you really dig into it, you have to say, well, why is that bad then? If this is how certain originally African, they're not now, they're well and truly American ideas, but like where these originally African and some kind of Iberian and Portuguese customs came from, like you get to be kind of creepily racist by accident by saying, oh no, this is all bad. You go, well, it actually fucking isn't. And it has a history that goes back, that is a legitimate expression of spirit and engagement with the spirit world and actual proper belief systems. So again, it is an absolute minefield that I'm sure people listening to this now are like, yeah, he's some kind of globalist Satanist. And that isn't, it's just not there in the historical record. And it's not how it's not why the devil is so prominent in the history of Western magic.
It just certainly seems as if lately it's became a real popular idea, and that's why.
Yeah, but this is, people are selling records like the whole you put an eye in the triangle behind Rihanna and retire,
right?
But like it's fucking moronic. Every time I hear that, okay, so not this Super Bowl, but the last one, the Katy Perry one.
Oh yeah,
what was it? If that was a ritual, what was that supposed to do? Seriously. People who are like, oh, it's the lion. I'm like, it's a tiger. The lions are eye of the tiger. And yeah, there are motifs in there, but it's kind of like saying if you throw some eggs and flour at a wall, you've made a cake. The motifs are in the show because culture is talking about them. And I hear this stuff that it's supposed to activate sleeper MK Ultra agents. I'm like, well, okay, did that happen? It didn't. Artists I mean, I think at this point in time they're laughing at us. Like you have to wonder what percentage of dramatically failing record sales is attributed to, Alex Jones shouting about a particular clip because it's like, oh no, I have to go and watch that, or no, I have to go and buy that. So I estimate that conspiratainment overreaction is what, 12% of global record sales at this point? Because who the fuck else buys music anymore? And
Right.
you look at it and go, that it's just not. It's not there. It's not how magic works. I do think there is probably a case to be made for a kind of very high level plan to normalize these symbols for whatever reason, could be for good or for worse, because the more desensitized or the less sensitized, to use proper England, that we get to them, the less they work. So I think magic is the birthright of all mankind. I think you are a sovereign consciousness, and your birthright is to sort of maximize that expression. And I think for me anyway, magic is a big part of that. And the symbol set is, we've just had a decade of it being debased and associated with really absurd stuff. So that's interesting because we do definitely have a 150-year assault on the things that are spiritually important, the sort of materialist assault. And now we have this utterly debased idea that this is all bad and is to do with some kind of cult that connects Katy Perry, a pedophile network, 9/11, the Vatican Bank. I don't think that's it. I think you could probably make a confident case that there is an intention behind the prominence of the symbols over the last 10 years, but a lot more work needs to be sort of put into why that would be the case.
And could you tell us more about this just incredible compilation of text that you've put together, Starships? Just an awesome, I've had an opportunity to read through some of it today. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. And for our listeners out there that might have an opportunity to pick up a copy, could you discuss it with us?
Yeah, sure. So it's called Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, because a number of things have kind of happened in the archaeological and scientific world over the last 25 years that I think have tremendous implications for the story we tell ourselves about mankind and our journey and our relationship to the universe. And one of the, I would say, sort of unexpected manifestations of this is the kind of literal ancient aliens belief. Because if you look at where that came from, it came from sort of looking at the official version of history and going, well, this isn't correct, to say the least. But if you're operating in a materialist paradigm, that means you end up having to explain, because you don't have a spirit world or a kind of consciousness technology to deal with, you end up having to explain what I think is a far more complicated extra-dimensional story with physical aliens, for which there's not a huge amount of effort. There's actually zero evidence for them being the originators of, say, religion or spirit on Earth. And that idea has kind of emerged out of the side effect of us thinking recorded civilization began 3,500 years ago. It didn't. The story is much, much deeper. And so Starships is a layering of genetic research and geological and linguistic research, and the kind of findings of a remarkable man called Dr. Witzel, who's a Harvard Indologist, who's kind of done a family tree of mythology. So when you think about it, when people say that there is a motif that recurs all over the world, they don't actually mean all over the world. Like these myths are unevenly rather than evenly distributed. There are very, very few evenly distributed myths, which would be the case if they somehow represent some kind of structure to the human mind or brain. So the idea that the sun is male, and the moon is female, you would think that would be more or less universal. It's not. In fact, by volume, the majority of cultures consider the moon male. So after a very long career of being a mythologist, he kind of family treed these myths because there are certain motifs like the separating of the sort of sky and the earth by one being male, one being female, by the parent, and letting the light in as the creation story is found in the Americas, it's found in Polynesia, it's found right up through India and Sumeria and Egypt. And the last time these cultures were in the one place on the kind of human journey out of Africa, for which that could happen, is sort of at a 30 to 50,000 year ago mark in island Southeast Asia. So that's kind of how you do this family treeing of the myths. And once you layer that piece in, and then you layer in the kind of end of the Ice Age, when you're dealing with island Southeast Asia, that's where most area of land was lost at the end of the Ice Age. So you're kind of in this odd world once you layer in the linguistics to demonstrate that cultural complexity happened there first out of Africa. You kind of have these pieces that you put together and go, well, wait a minute, I think I've heard this story before. I think I've heard this story of kind of a complex culture and a sunken continent, and then people kind of spreading out, and the kind of building of additional complexity in the story of the flood and the stars showing up in very similar ways elsewhere. And then, you find Gunung Padang in Indonesia, which is sort of east of this sort of Sunderland landmass. And you go, well, hang on a minute. That's a 25,000-year-old step pyramid, essentially. And then you kind of turn around and you put these pieces together and you look at the map of the world, and suddenly pyramid building overlays with these same sort of Laurasian motifs. And so Starships for me was, because I'm very open to the idea that humans were originally built by aliens at like the 2 million year mark, because the question marks remain over the origins of a human as a physical specimen, right? I want to have more intelligent discussions about AAT and extra dimensional theory and history and all that kind of thing. And we've kind of caught ourselves in a net of not really understanding human timelines or the latest consciousness science, which need to be the foundational elements before you start looking at whether that is sufficient to model all the strange things we find in history. Because at the moment, people just kind of play bingo up and down the timeline and call aliens on the things they find are a bit weird. And I thought we'd grow out of that, but we haven't. And so it's kind of a discussion piece that's very influenced by the work of people like Dr. Jacques Vallée about how we think about these ideas and these potential beings and what their engagement with the world, with our world, looks like across the human timeline. And some remarkable things show up that pertain to the story of the Western magical tradition. At the end of... So when the Hermetica was translated out of Greek, so the Corpus Hermeticum was translated out of Greek in Florence, which sort of kickstarted the Renaissance, there was a belief that Hermes was a real person. Hermes Trismegistus is obviously the sort of pseudo-author of these books. That he was a real person, and he was an associate of Moses, who was also a real person, and that it represented a survival of the wisdom from before the flood. Now, historically, that's actually not the case. The Hermetica is a remarkable collection of documents from the sort of late period of Egypt, from Alexandria, and it's a mixture of Egyptian ideas and Near Eastern ideas and sort of Greek philosophy, and this sort of heady mix of just trying to make sense of the world, which was basically what Alexandria did. So it's not. The documents are between sort of, not even 50 BC, so 50 AD to like 300 AD. But if you actually look at the motifs in it from this kind of mythic family triangle and work out which pieces came from Egypt and then where did those pieces come from, and you can kind of realize that the guys who thought that the Hermetic wisdom was a survival of the wisdom from before the flood, they meant the biblical flood, and they thought it was literally true. In a funny way, they're accidentally correct, because these pieces of the sky ground dualism and the stars matching certain things, and the microcosm of the human body and the human person and the macrocosm of the universe being these kind of fractal same things, appear to all be there at this time depth of that sort of 30,000 years ago mark, at a time where we can genetically and linguistically put ourselves in island Southeast Asia, where I first think that sort of complexity arose. And we've kind of gone round the houses to think, they were accidentally correct, that some pieces of this, like the bones of Hermetic wisdom, may well go all the way back to long before the end of the Ice Age, and thus you can make the case in a court of law that it represents the survival of wisdom from before the flood.
So you would say that you notice a lot of activity around 30,000 years ago then?
Short answer, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm just going to say yes. So what people maybe don't realize is that when we left Africa at the sort of 70,000 mark, we sort of turned right and jogged along the beach and very quickly got to Australia within a few thousand years. But we also got, more importantly, to what is now the kind of Borneo Island, Southeast Asia area, which we call Sundaland because it's on the Sunda Shelf, but that was all above seawater. It's actually a remarkable place to develop cultural complexity because it has lots of fresh water, not much in the way of super predators, but lots of little rivers that allow the development of boats and rafts and things that subsequently were used to, colonize half the planet, which is the Pacific. But it's this remarkable place where we're obviously there in open ocean navigating for long enough to develop malarial markers or gene markers that are associated with a mutation to protect against cold weather in a very warm environment. So we're out in the open ocean. We find all these things in the blood. We find kind of Asian grandmother and Asian mother genes that show that there was a back crossing back into India and Eurasia from island Southeast Asia into the kind of cultures that went on to develop the Vedic and the Indus cultures, basically, and also the UAE and Egypt and all kinds of places. We can actually locate people once we got them there and can linguistically demonstrate that cultural complexity arose first there out of anywhere out of Africa. Then we start to get all these gene markers connecting from that point to the other side of the Pacific and to the places that became Samaria and Egypt. But at that 30, you kind of have I think it's at the 30,000 mark, because that coincides with a Berkeley linguist called Dr. Joanna Nichols' idea that that's where that piece of cultural complexity happened, around that point. Dr. Witzel, when he's talking about the emergence of what he calls the Laurasian myth cycle, which is the kind of bones of a belief system at that time depth that was old enough to kind of influence and mutate through the colonization of the Americas and Eurasia, he gives that a 50 to 30,000 year window to show up, because we can't really tell beyond that. But that's an astonishingly large amount of time. That's 20,000 years. That is 10 times the distance between us and Jesus. That's crazy,
Right.
But those are the numbers you can deal with, because you're sort of dealing with what is effectively half-lives. But the Joanna Nichols information means I kind of want to calibrate that closer to the 30,000 year mark. But yeah, so you kind of have these big giant windows. It's the best we can do, but we kind of have to do this bit first and then go looking for aliens or whatever it is we want to look for, because we've literally been tripping over our own feet, just like playing bingo with these ideas. And there is some fairly good science. And I spent quite a while making sure, I went to Oxford to talk to the guys the geneticists who were involved in the Out of Africa project, because I'm aware in the alternative media of what some of the problems are with things like genetic dating. And so I kind of looked at them and I had about 15 questions of, well, how does this work? And how does this work? Just to make sure that it's there. And whilst we don't know where humans came from or where DNA came from, because these things can't be replicated, all those kind of questions are big and the answers are probably very weird. But they're also very old questions, that's at the 2 million year mark. Whereas this is the journey of sort of 70,000 years ago to today. It's the journey of which parts of that experience of that kind of human colonial effort are retained in the Western magical tradition?
It's interesting too because I had an opportunity to speak with Michael Cremo. He put together a book called Forbidden Archaeology, where they've got pictures of tools that, I mean, could be in the millions of years old.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, like, our society, or just people here on Earth, if it's like there's this recycling system. Once we reach a certain point, there's almost this natural reset button that takes away the majority of the population and the technology, and we almost start over, but we go on a little bit of a different path.
Look, at that point, it's anybody's guess. Like, I actually quite like Michael Cremo. I've got Forbidden Archaeology and so on. Now, some of this stuff, he has a Richard Hoagland thing, which is he only needs to be right once. Now, a lot of the stuff, well, some of the stuff isn't right. So I think, say, the sort of boot prints that are 60 million years old are actually like trilobite organism impressions in the mud. But there are, underneath between 250,000-year-old and 2 million-year-old volcanic rock objects that are man-made. Like, someone needs to answer that. And funnily enough, this story doesn't preclude any of what you were just talking about, Rex, at all. This one's based on the things that I'm like, okay, so we can know these things about our journey. But 70,000 years, right? That sounds like a long time until you realize that humans are at least 2 million years old. So we're still missing most of the story. And the idea that there were other, maybe, colonial expeditions out of Africa that failed and thus don't show up in our genes, that's an example of them. I think, frankly, in a lot of cases with some of Cremo's weirdest stuff, I think time travel is in the mix. Simple as that. Like,
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, you were reading my mind right there.
Yeah.
So with the time travel stuff, Gordon, I mean, there's new stuff out every day that, like the other day I saw this, it looked like a stone Nokia phone, like something that had been, sitting there for so long that it turned into stone. There's that old Charles Chaplin video behind the scenes where that guy's walking around dressed as a chick and he's talking on a cell phone in black and white. And then obviously some of these other anomalies, like how could there possibly be tools underneath lava, that's 100 million years old? And maybe there was some type of time travel. And, if time travel exists 50,000 years from now, well, then it exists now, right? So,
well, yeah. And the other thing is the dimensional stuff. So when and this is a very kind of Jacques Vallée answer, but I don't think the UFO phenomena is very well explained with the hypothesis of little green men. I think we're dealing with something that's much more enigmatic and extra dimensional, and the whole point of starships is to kind of take you on a journey of how they have interacted with mankind over the last 70,000 years. When we say it's extra dimensional, or like I prefer a spirit interpretation to a UFO one, that is not for a minute to suggest that these impacts are exclusively non-physical. So I also think in that kind of, again, window area sense, like where does Bigfoot go when no one can see him? And it's a kind of tree falling in the woods thing to say. But some of this stuff could be extra dimensional stuff as well, like brief wandering in and out of this dimension. If you show up 2 million years ago, it's kind of boring here. Like if you're looking for, a decent discussion or a good cup of coffee. So that also kind of makes sense. I put that in the time travel thing. We have people who literally go into other dimensions and experience time loss. Again, the famous ones are UFOs, but you have fairy examples going back through history, and they're real events. Like people are fed, they're given food, they sleep, they get married, they come back, no time has passed, or whatever. So yeah, I quite like Michael Cremo's stuff. I think a lot of it, and I don't begrudge him his spiritual view of the world in the slightest, because he still is doing quite good work, quite rigorous work in most cases in looking at these anomalous pieces of history. I probably don't agree with his kind of Vedic cosmology that says the world is that many millions of years old. But that's fine. That's the difference between data and interpretation. His data are quite good and quite strong. His interpretation is his own, and he's allowed to have it, and that's all good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what's great about what makes us who we are is we have the opportunity to think for ourselves, and we're not assimilated by the Borg and all think in some hive mind. So that's the beauty of being a human is imagination and opportunity. So I really appreciate the way you put that together. And I just find it fascinating because it seems like history rewrites itself all of the time. Whenever I think I finally know what's going on, something comes out that shows me I have no clue. It's incredible.
There's some politics to that, which is so important. Like if we don't, and I mean, if we don't do a good job of telling our history, someone else will tell it. And that's the reason I wrote the book. I mean, that was just me ragging on alternative historians who, see aliens behind every pyramid. But the mainstream ones are like equally to blame because we've left it up to people who literally don't believe in the things that they are researching to tell us what's going on. Like you have materialists standing up telling you about what, about ancient Egyptian demons or Sumerian gods. And I'm like, you guys don't actually believe in any of this stuff. Like you don't believe there is a spiritual reality behind it. So we've left it in the hands of, like on both sides, idiots. And there is a deep politics to telling, and especially when it comes to magic, because that was the kind of classic role of the shaman, was to keep the story of the tribe. And we just kind of outsourced it over the last 120 years, and it's been a fucking disaster. And we need to insource it. There's huge if you can tell people where they're from, you can tell them who they are, and that I don't give anyone that.
Now, you also brought up, the X-Men that you have kind of created over the past, or not created, but that you have made contacts with over the past 20 years. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that because, there's been things in my life, Gordon, that have happened, synchronicities that I can't explain. If you look at the mathematical possibilities, it's virtually impossible. It's a, trillion to one as I don't know exactly, but let's just use that as an example. So I often feel like there's things behind the scenes that are kind of orchestrating events and bringing me into people's paths at certain times for certain reasons. And, the X-Men, these spirit guides that you talk about, how many of them do you know about, and how do you actually make contact with them?
Well, I mean, it's literally angels dancing on a pinhead as to the volumes of it. Like I think our world and the spirit world, such as they are different, quite populous. And I don't know, like I mean, Rex, it's been the conclusion of people far smarter than me and definitely more spiritual than me that it is exactly as you described it, where we're dealing with a populous universe of beings who are actively engaged in stories on an individual basis, but on a planetary basis, and moving things around and showing us stuff and just organizing things in a way for reasons that we can't actually discern. Some of them may be quite manipulative. We can hope that some of them are nice, but they're not. As for the ones, I mean, as for the kind of, I guess, regulars, from a spirit perspective, I don't. It's kind of the same with Andrea. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but what I will say is that however you get into your spiritual journey, if it is one that incorporates the kind of reality of a spirit world, then they will eventually find you. Like it doesn't matter if you're doing it from like you spend a year doing daily chakra exercises, you start shoaling a bunch of sigils, whatever it is, you kind of end up getting their attention, for better or for worse. And in a lot of cases, and not in a controlling sense, but in a lot of cases, they choose you. It's kind of like a friendship where they're interested or not, you're interested or not. Let's see how that goes. And it's difficult to explain. Like you just kind of, you find the ones that you find. I do actually have, for people who are interested, not starships, but I actually have another book coming out April 8th called the Chaos Protocols with Llewellyn, and that kind of goes through in a more specific way, like how you make your universe big enough for spirits, and the kind of Magick's great prize is the certainty that life continues after death. And in fact, Terence McKenna said the purpose of life is to familiarize yourself with the after death state so that the process of dying doesn't come as a shock to the system. And I think that's true. And I think that's very much what Egyptian culture was about. And if people are kind of interested in, well, like, seriously though, how do I begin playing with this? There are some rituals that you can do entirely on your own with no stuff that's coming out in the Chaos Protocols. And as to why they work, that information's in Starships. They sort of unintentionally ended up interrelating. Right? They're not related at all, and they're not sequels, and you don't have to have one or the other. But if people are kind of interested in this, you need the first step, as I said before, is knowing in your bones that this stuff is real, that there is a reality to spirit phenomena. And you can trigger that by getting a bunch of friends and breaking into an abandoned mental hospital in the middle of the night with an Ouija board and scaring yourself shitless. There are, like, you could throw a rock and hit a better way of doing it, but technically that will do it, because you won't get out of that without realizing, good Lord, this stuff is terrifying. Well, you come away thinking it's exclusively terrifying, but there'll be no convincing yourself it wasn't real after that.
I've noticed certain areas kind of are hot spots for darker energies and entities. Several years ago, when I started to really research and study different forms of the occult, I picked up a copy of the Lesser Keys of Solomon on eBay. It was a used copy from 1913. And when I finally got it at the house, I mean, you could immediately feel almost like this dark, dense is the best way to put it, energy. It was a real heavy presence. And I didn't even tell my wife that I had the book. And it got to the point, I had it for a few months, and something didn't feel right. Something in my gut was telling me to get rid of it. And I did. I gave it away. And the moment, that same day that I gave it away, my wife came home and she goes, it feels different here. It just feels lighter. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you bought a used grimoire. Someone that story tracks. That's exactly, and that denseness. There's especially with a lesser key work, and if people have been playing in the kind of sort of darker end of that spirit list, the density is an observed phenomena. The blood pressure drop, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would. That's a remarkable, like, kind of historic document. You think, 1913, this will probably be worth something at some stage. But as a general rule, if you're new, don't buy a used grimoire, because that's what happens. There's a whole kind of thing on. But that being said, like I just said about how to describe this, as I just said about the hypothetical mental hospital, you kind of now know in a way that is going to be difficult to explain, but you and your wife know that something fucking weird happened, that a book could change the sensation of a house like that.
Right. So
that's one of those, like, okay, I don't know how it works, but I will never not be convinced that it doesn't. Like, whatever it is, there is a reality behind these phenomena, and that piece of information, if people are interested in pursuing magic or kind of engaging with the spirit world on an animus model, you need, however you get it, again, the best way is maybe 2 weeks with a responsible shaman and some ayahuasca in the Amazon, but we can afford what we can afford. Like, the Ouija board mental hospital thing will do it. There's more risks, but the whole point is, it doesn't matter what it is. You just have to know to the point that nothing will take away from you that this is real. And then you're kind of playing a whole new game. You're actually living in a whole new universe. And really everything up to after that is you exploring a whole new universe. And that's probably why magicians get so, multifarious in their expression after that happens, because we're all kind of looking for that solve of what it is we experienced.
Right. And I know that we're getting limited on time here, so if I could just ask you maybe one more question before we close out. For those that actually do practice magic, study the occult, have an opportunity to reach into these different dimensions and communicate with certain entities, surely sometimes there's after effects or resonance of energies that come back with them. If somebody wanted to break all ties and like do a complete cleanse, eliminate those type of strings around them, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, sure. You want the fire blanket. That makes sense. There are kind of the first thing you would do is get some sea salt and like a plastic cup, and put the sea salt in the cup and take it into the shower and essentially pour salt water over yourself. And you can do like the asperge me with Hyssop Lord little prayer or what have you. And if that isn't it, like if you've really fucked up, you can get, this sounds more ominous than it is, but you can get some dragon's blood, which is actually which is an incense, or you can get it as an oil, and it comes from a tree, like a sort of, that only grows in Yemen. So it's not actual dragon's blood, unsurprisingly, but it's a resinous incense. And that's kind of like ghost bleach. So you would put that in cleaning products and clean the walls and so on. And that does tend to blow a lot of things out, everything out basically, but it blows out the good things. So it's kind of like antibiotics and your gut flora. So your kind of natural spirit ecosystem will take a while to recover as well. So that is the literal fire blanket if you fucked up. But go down the kind of salt and the sage thing's sort of, the sage thing has an odd history because it's very much of it is to do with the history of Hollywood. I mean, the idea kind of came from Hollywood in that sense. But you can go into any kind of store, or there's plenty of witches on Etsy or what have you, and get some sort of room cleansing incense, and you can do that in your house with the saltwater piece. And if that, again, the nuclear option or the proper fire blanket is dragon's blood in that sense, and just pick whatever like protection or exercising prayer sort of matches your belief system. There's some quite good ones for like to Saint Cyprian. So you either Google Saint Cyprian or San Cipriano banishing prayers. That one's quite good. Or exorcism prayers. And you'll find a kind of usually a fairly benign but potent churchy one that people don't really have a problem with using. But yeah, that's the fire blanket.
Yeah, great. Really appreciate that. And, I'd love to pick your brain for another 8 hours, but I know it's getting late where you're at. So,
Well, it was an absolute pleasure, Rex. So yeah, we can definitely do it again.
Wonderful. I was just going to say I'd love to have you on again sometime. So I really appreciate that, Gordon. And for those,
I'll make sure I call you from this laptop so that it.
Yeah, that was weird, man. I mean, I'll tell you what. We started talking, and then I thought you turned into an android on me there for a minute.
I saved that for the end of the show.
That was really cool. Like the Total Recall movie where Arnold Schwarzenegger is trying to get past customs, and he's dressed in some he looks like this giant female, and then the guy asks him, "How long are you here for?" And he starts going, 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and then his face comes off.
Isn't it? The last time it happened. Yeah, you're right.
So right on, man. And for those that have had the opportunity to listen to Gordon, check out his website. I mean, talk about a plethora of intelligent information, just awesome gems there. runesoup.com. That's RUNE soup.com. Also, his book just came out, folks. I mean, this thing's been out for a couple of weeks, and it is fantastic. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing yet, but what I have read is incredible. It's Starships, a prehistory of the spirits. So, hey, this has been awesome, Gordon. Thank you so much, and until next time, man, may the force be with you, my friend.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rex.
You're welcome.